The air over Kyushu in southern Japan on the morning of April 5, 1945, was thick with the scent of cherry blossoms and aviation fuel, a jarring perfume of life and impending death. Sub-Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, barely 20 years old, stood ramrod straight on the packed earth of the Kanoya Air Base. The white hachimaki headband, a symbol of perseverance and courage, was tied tightly around his forehead, its tails fluttering in the propeller wash of the Mitsubishi A6M50 fighters being warmed up on the flight line. Today, he was scheduled to become a god. A warrior deity, an incarnation of the Kamikaze, the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invaders centuries ago. The rhetoric was intoxicating, a powerful opiate against the gnawing fear that coiled in his gut. His squadron commander, a veteran of the fighting in China with eyes that seemed impossibly old, had spoken to them just an hour before dawn. "You are no longer mere men," he declared, his voice raspy but firm. "You are the sharpened tip of the Emperor's spear. You are the pure spirit of Yamato. One man, one ship. This is your glorious duty, your ultimate honor." Saburo looked at the faces of the other young men in his unit, the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, 2nd Chutai. Some were stoic, their expressions carved from stone. Others betrayed a nervous energy, their hands repeatedly checking the straps of their flight helmets. He saw Kenji, a boy from his own village who used to spend hours sketching birds, now tracing the outline of the rising sun on his fuselage with a trembling finger. They were all so young, their pilot training truncated, their flight hours barely adequate for combat, let alone for the pinpoint accuracy their final mission demanded. The official name for their units was Shinpu, the formal reading of the characters for Divine Wind, but the world would come to know them by the more common reading, Kamikaze. It was a name that promised salvation through oblivion. The ritual was as precise as a pre-flight checklist. This morning, there had been a small cup of sake, the ceremonial last drink. It was not a celebration, but a sacrament. Saburo held the small porcelain cup, his knuckles white. He thought of his mother in their small wooden house in the hills outside Kagoshima. He had written his final letter last night, the ink blurring slightly under the dim light of a single bulb. He wrote of honor, of dying for the emperor and for the sacred soil of Japan. He did not write about the churning fear, or the recurring dream of the American ships, massive, gray fortresses bristling with guns that spat fire into the sky. He did not write about how he wished he could have just one more bowl of his mother's ramen. He sealed the letter along with a lock of his hair and a clipped fingernail, as was tradition, a remnant for his family to bury. Now, standing on the airfield, the sake felt cold as it went down, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the commander's words. He was given his flight assignment, a Zero fighter, Model 52. It was an aging design, but still nimble. His plane, however, had been modified. Most of its machine guns had been removed to save weight. Its landing gear was fixed, not meant to be retracted. This was a one-way machine. Slung beneath its belly was the instrument of its true purpose, a 250-kilogram bomb, fused to detonate on impact. There was no mechanism to release it. The plane itself was the delivery system. The pilot was the guidance. Saburo ran his hand along the cool metal flank of his assigned aircraft. It felt alien, a coffin with wings. He was being asked to merge his very being with this machine, to become a living projectile. He saw the faded chrysanthemum insignia near the cockpit, the symbol of the emperor he was sworn to protect. He bowed his head, a silent prayer mixing with the deafening roar of the engines. The Americans are at Okinawa's doorstep. They call it radar picket line. A shield of destroyers, daring us to attack. Lieutenant Commander Goro Nanaka, the base operations officer, had briefed them with a frantic energy, stabbing a long wooden pointer at a map of the Ryukyu Islands. The map was covered in red circles, each one representing an American naval task force. These destroyers are our primary targets. They are the eyes of the enemy fleet. Blind them, and the carriers and battleships become vulnerable. Today, we launch Kikusui No. 1. The name itself was poetic and tragic, Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, a reference to the crest of a legendary 14th-century samurai, Masashige, who knowingly went into a battle he could not win, choosing a loyal death over dishonor. Saburo felt a surge of something, not courage, but a kind of fatalistic resolve. The stories of the samurai were drilled into them from childhood. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that to die in service was the highest calling, that to cling to life in the face of duty was the ultimate shame. The propaganda machine had seamlessly woven these ancient codes into the fabric of modern, total war. They were told American soldiers were demons, that they would desecrate their homes and dishonor their families if they ever set foot on the home islands. The choice, as it was presented, was simple: a glorious death in the sky, or a shameful survival followed by the destruction of everything they held dear. As he climbed into the cramped cockpit, the smell of oil and worn leather filling his nostrils, Saburo strapped himself in. A ground crewman, an old man with a kind, wrinkled face, leaned in. He didn't offer words of encouragement. He simply handed Saburo a small, slightly wilted cherry blossom branch. "For luck," the old man whispered, his voice cracking. Saburo tucked it into the pocket of his flight suit. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, a piece of the life he was about to leave behind forever. The signal came at 1400 hours. A flare arced into the pale blue sky. It was time. Saburo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, thrumming bass of the Sakai engine. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Zero lurched, gathering speed down the bumpy runway. One by one, the planes of Kikusui No. 1 lifted into the air, a swarm of angry hornets rising from the nest. They formed up clumsily. Many of the pilots, like Saburo, were not accustomed to large formation flying. Their mission was simple in theory, terrifying in practice: fly south-southeast for 2 hours, locate the American radar picket stations, select a target, and dive. He gripped the control stick, his knuckles slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. The world below became a tapestry of green fields and blue water. Japan, his beautiful, sacred homeland, shrank behind him. He glanced to his port side and saw Kenji's plane, flying a little unsteadily. Kenji gave him a short, sharp nod, his face pale behind his goggles. There was no turning back. The mission planners knew that American Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, patrolling from their carriers, would be hunting for them. The Hellcats were faster, more heavily armed, and their pilots were seasoned combat veterans. The Japanese strategy was one of saturation. They launched dozens of planes from multiple airfields, a mix of Zeros, bombers, and even obsolete biplanes, hoping that some would inevitably get through the defensive screen. Saburo was not an escort. He was not a fighter. He was a bomb. His Zero, stripped of its armor and laden with its deadly payload, felt heavy and unresponsive. Every gust of wind seemed to want to push him off course, to deny him his final, terrible purpose. The sun glinted off the canopy, and for a moment, the sky was just a vast, beautiful emptiness. It was the last peace he would ever know. An hour and a half into the flight, the radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. Enemy fighters sighted. 10 o'clock high. The voice was young, panicked. Saburo's head snapped up and to the left. He saw them. Dark blue specks against the brighter blue of the sky, growing larger with shocking speed. The Grumman Hellcats. They descended on the Japanese formation like hawks diving on a flock of sparrows. The air, once empty, was suddenly filled with streaking tracer rounds and puffs of black smoke from flak bursts. A plane to his right, a Val dive bomber, disintegrated in a flash of orange and black, its pieces tumbling into the sea far below. Saburo's training kicked in, what little he had. He threw his Zero into a hard bank, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. The world became a dizzying blur of sky and ocean. A Hellcat flashed past his canopy, its 6.50 caliber machine guns winking at him. He heard the thump-thump-thump of bullets hitting his own fuselage, but the plane held together. The formation scattered completely. It was every man for himself. The mission was no longer about a coordinated attack, it was a desperate, individual race to the target zone. He saw Kenji's plane, a Hellcat locked onto its tail. Puffs of smoke began to trail from Kenji's engine. Instead of trying to evade, Kenji did something that froze Saburo's blood. He nosed his plane down, not in a controlled dive, but in a final, desperate plunge toward the empty ocean. There were no ships in sight. Kenji was simply ending it, denying the American pilot the kill. Saburo watched the Zero strike the water, vanishing in a plume of white spray. One less. The weight of his own headband, his own bomb, and his own promise felt heavier than ever. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the cloud layer below, praying he could shake the hunters and find the destroyers that awaited him on the horizon. Saburo burst through the bottom of the cloud layer, his ears popping from the rapid change in altitude. Below him, the sea was no longer an empty expanse. It was dotted with the unmistakable shapes of warships. He had found them. The American radar picket line. Against the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific, the ships looked like gray, steel splinters. They churned white wakes behind them, steaming in a seemingly random pattern that he knew was a calculated, defensive patrol. His radio was silent now, a dead testament to the chaos that had shattered his formation. He was alone. The Hellcats were gone, perhaps chasing others, perhaps assuming he had been shot down. For a fleeting moment, a dangerous thought entered his mind: survival. He could ditch the plane, try to make it to a nearby island. He could live. The thought was a venomous whisper, a betrayal of his comrades, his family, his emperor. He crushed it instantly, shame burning his cheeks. He remembered Kenji's final, desperate plunge. He remembered the old man with the cherry blossom branch. He was a floating chrysanthemum. His purpose was to fall beautifully. He scanned the flotilla, his eyes searching for the perfect target. There were at least 5 destroyers and several smaller support craft. His training manual, the Tokubetsu Kōgekitai manual, had been explicit: aim for the area between the bridge and the forward smokestack. A hit there could detonate the ship's magazines or cripple its command structure. He selected his target, a destroyer on the outer edge of the formation, steaming a steady course. It was the USS Laffey, though he did not know its name. To him, it was simply Target 770, a number on a hull, an obstacle to the purity of his homeland. He began his approach, flying low, skimming the waves to stay below the ship's primary radar detection envelope. The Zero shuddered as he pushed the throttle to its limit, the engine screaming in protest. The destroyer grew rapidly in his sights, no longer a splinter but a formidable fortress. He could see sailors on the deck, small figures scrambling, pointing at him. A blossom of black smoke puffed near his wing, the first burst of anti-aircraft fire. Then another, and another. The sky around him was suddenly filled with these dark, lethal flowers. He had expected it, but the reality was a terrifying, visceral assault. The ship was fighting back with a ferocity he hadn't fully comprehended. He began the climb and dive maneuver drilled into him at Kanoya. He pulled the stick back, sending the Zero soaring upward to an altitude of about 500 meters, trading his speed for height. He felt a moment of weightlessness at the apex of his climb, the engine groaning. For a heartbeat, he hung suspended between the heavens and the hell below. The ship, now directly beneath him, seemed to unleash its full fury. Tracers, like fiery red fingers, reached for him from every part of the vessel. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. It wasn't a single stream, it was a wall of hot metal, a curtain of death he had to fly through. His grip on the control stick was so tight his fingers ached. He took a deep breath, the air thin and cold. He shouted the name of his squadron, a primal scream lost in the roar of the engine and the cacophony of the guns: Shinpu. Then he pushed the stick forward, nosing the Zero over into its final, terminal dive. The world became a tunnel. His vision narrowed, focused entirely on the gray deck of the destroyer rushing up to meet him. The ship grew at an alarming rate, filling his entire windscreen. He could now clearly see the twin gun mounts of the 5-inch batteries traversing frantically to track him, their muzzles flashing with orange light. He saw the rapid, frantic sparkle of the smaller 20mm and 40mm cannons, their tracers zipping past his canopy with an audible hiss. A line of impact stitched across his port wing, tearing jagged holes in the metal skin. The plane bucked violently, trying to pull away, but he fought it, his muscles straining to hold the dive angle steady. The altimeter was unwinding with dizzying speed. 400 meters. 300 meters. The ship's superstructure, the bridge, the radar masts, every detail became hyper-focused. He could see the individual helmets of the gun crews. They were not demons. They were men, just like him, fighting for their lives with a desperate tenacity. The thought was disorienting, a crack in the foundation of his indoctrination. He had been taught to hate them, to see them as subhuman invaders. But in these last seconds, all he saw was a terrifying, shared humanity in a moment of extreme violence. He ignored the thought, focusing on his aim point, just aft of the bridge. One man, one ship. The commander's words echoed in his mind, a final mantra. He was the spear tip. He was the divine wind. He braced himself, his body rigid, his eyes wide open, determined to witness his own impact. Aboard the USS Laffey, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. Kamikaze coming in. 300 degrees, diving, the shout came from a lookout. Gunners, barely out of their teens, swung their cannons toward the new threat. The ship's Combat Information Center, CIC, was a frenzy of reports, tracking the Lone Zero as it began its deadly plunge. The ship's captain, Frederick Beckton, calmly gave orders to the helm, hard right rudder. The destroyer began to heel over, trying to present a smaller target, to throw off the pilot's aim. The 5-inch guns fired, their shells programmed with proximity fuses designed to explode near the aircraft, but the Zero was too close, moving too fast. It slipped through the flak barrage. The 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons opened up, creating a dense lattice of steel. "He's still coming." "Keep firing," screamed a gunnery officer. For the men on the deck, time seemed to slow down. They could see the fixed landing gear of the Japanese plane, a sure sign of a suicide attacker. They could see the red meatball insignia on the wings and the dark shape of the bomb slung underneath. They could almost see the pilot in the cockpit, a determined figure on a collision course with their lives. The roar of the Zero's engine grew from a whine to a deafening, soul-shaking scream. Men instinctively ducked, their faces contorted in a mixture of fear and defiance. They had drilled for this, they had faced it before, but it never lost its unique terror, the horror of an enemy who was not trying to escape, an enemy whose only measure of success was his own obliteration. The Zero, trailing smoke and shedding pieces of its damaged wing, seemed to falter for a split second. A cheer almost rose from the American gunners, thinking they had stopped it. But the pilot corrected his course with a final, superhuman effort. Instead of the intended target of the superstructure, the plane was now aimed lower, toward the aft section of the ship. At the last possible moment, Saburo must have seen his aim was off. Perhaps a 40mm shell had damaged his controls, or wounded him. His final act was not one of precision, but of sheer will. The Mitsubishi A6M50 did not hit the bridge. Instead, it struck the ship a glancing blow, its wing and fuselage scraping along the deck near one of the aft 5-inch gun mounts before the entire aircraft, along with its 250-kilogram bomb, cartwheeled into the sea. The explosion was immense, but muffled by the water. A colossal geyser of white water, black oil, and mangled aircraft parts erupted beside the Laffey, drenching the deck and the stunned sailors. The ship shuddered violently from the force of the underwater concussion, and hot shrapnel from the bomb and the disintegrating plane peppered the hull. Several men near the impact point were wounded by flying debris, their ears ringing from the blast. But the destroyer's hull was not breached. The main guns were still operational. Saburo Sakai's mission had failed. His life, his training, his final, terrifying dive, all of it had resulted in only minor damage and a few injuries. He had become one with his machine and met oblivion, but the American warship, bruised but alive, steamed on through the smoke, its gunners already swiveling to find the next threat in the sky. The clock in the USS Laffey's Combat Information Center ticked past 8:30 on the morning of April 16, 1945. The encounter with Saburo Sakai's Zero 10 days prior had been a jarring preface. Today was the full, terrifying epic. Stationed at Radar Picket Station 1, some 30 miles north of Okinawa, the Laffey was the canary in the coal mine, the exposed nerve ending of the entire invasion fleet. Her job, along with the landing support craft she protected, was to detect and intercept incoming Japanese air raids before they could reach the main fleet of carriers and transports. For the past hour, reports had been flooding in. The Japanese were coming. Not in ones or twos, but in a deluge. This was Kikusui No. 3, a massive, coordinated assault even larger than the first. On the Laffey's bridge, Captain Frederick Beckton watched the sky with grim resolve. He knew his ship, an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, was one of the most advanced of its kind, bristling with radar-directed guns. But he also knew that no amount of technology could fully shield his crew from an enemy determined to die. The first attacker, an Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, appeared as a speck, quickly growing into a winged predator. Target acquired. Port side, coming in low. The ship's defenses roared to life. The dual-purpose 5-inch guns thundered, creating a barrier of flak. The 40mm Bofors mounts, 4 barrels each, pumped out shells in a steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump. The Val, trailing smoke, flew directly at the ship. It was a horrifying spectacle, a contest of will between the pilot and over 200 American sailors. The Val did not deviate. It absorbed a blizzard of shells, its engine catching fire, its wings Swiss-cheesed with holes, but it kept coming. The pilot was already dead or dying, a mere passenger in his own guided missile. The plane slammed into one of the aft 40mm gun mounts, the one designated Mount 42. The explosion was deafening, a hellish blossom of fire and twisted metal. The 1,100 pounds of the aircraft, its remaining fuel, and its bomb detonated almost simultaneously, engulfing the entire stern section in a sheet of flame. The men at that gun mount, and those nearby, vanished. The fire was immediate and intense, fed by aviation fuel that splashed across the deck, setting ammunition lockers ablaze. The cooked-off shells began to explode, sending shrapnel flying in all directions and making firefighting efforts a suicidal proposition. Before the crew could even register the full extent of the damage, another cry came from the lookouts. Bogey! Starboard beam! A second Val was streaking in from the opposite side. Captain Beckton, his face illuminated by the flames behind him, ordered another hard rudder turn. The ship responded sluggishly, its maneuverability hampered by the chaos. The gunners who were still able to fight swung their hot barrels toward the new threat. They fired with a desperate fury, many of them singed, wounded, and watching their shipmates burn, yet they held their posts. This second attacker, like the first, seemed unstoppable, a specter of doom that ignored the laws of physics and self-preservation. It screamed toward the beleaguered destroyer, its engine a high-pitched, terrifying banshee wail, aimed directly at the superstructure. This second Val, flying through a curtain of fire so thick it seemed impossible for anything to survive, struck the Laffey just aft of the rear smokestack. The impact and subsequent explosion ripped a huge hole in the main deck, destroying another 20mm gun gallery and sending a cascade of burning fuel and debris down into the engineering spaces below. Crucially, the blast severed the ship's main steam lines. The destroyer lost power and went dead in the water. The internal communication systems failed. The after-steering control was obliterated. The USS Laffey was now a floating, burning, stationary target. The fires from the two impacts raged, merging into one great inferno that threatened to split the ship in two. Dense, black, oily smoke billowed hundreds of feet into the air, a funeral pyre visible for miles. On the bridge, Captain Beckton was cut off from the rear half of his own ship. He had no way of knowing who was alive, who was dead, or the full extent of the damage. Yet, the attacks did not stop. The smoke acted as a beacon for other kamikaze pilots. The horror was just beginning. Through the black smoke, a third plane appeared, a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter. It came in low and fast, strafing the deck and aiming for the heart of the ship, the bridge. Beckton and his officers watched its approach through the bridge's narrow viewports, a sickening feeling of helplessness washing over them. They were trapped, unable to move, able to do nothing but watch death approach. The Oscar pilot was either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally lucky. He weaved through the remaining sporadic gunfire, his plane's machine guns stitching lines of bullets across the Laffey's superstructure. Sailors dove for cover behind anything that might offer protection. The Oscar didn't aim to bomb or crash into the hull, its target was the command crew. The plane passed directly over the bridge with a deafening roar, so low that the officers inside felt the vibration in their bones. As it passed, the pilot released his bomb. It struck the top of the forward 5-inch gun Mount 52, with a glancing blow before bouncing off and exploding in the water just off the port bow. The explosion sent a shockwave through the ship and showered the deck with shrapnel, but it caused no critical damage. The Oscar, its primary mission failed, then banked sharply. But instead of flying away, it circled back. The pilot was not finished. He was coming around for a strafing run, or perhaps a second, suicidal pass. The gunners who could still fight tracked him, their movements sluggish from fatigue and shock. Just as the Oscar lined up on the ship again, it happened. A flight of 4 American F-4U Corsair fighters from the carrier USS Essex, part of the Combat Air Patrol, screamed down from above. Their leader, a pilot named Carl Riemann, locked onto the Oscar and squeezed his trigger. A stream of .50 caliber rounds tore the Japanese fighter apart in midair. It exploded in a satisfying flash, a brief moment of catharsis for the tormented crew of the Laffey. The Corsairs were their cavalry, their angels of deliverance. But the sky was still full of enemies. No sooner had the Oscar been dispatched than a fourth plane, another Val, dove from directly astern, emerging from the pillar of black smoke like a demon from hell. The aft section of the ship was a blind spot, the fires were too intense, the smoke too thick. The remaining gunners couldn't see it until it was almost on top of them. This Val crashed directly into the burning wreckage of the aft superstructure, right where the second plane had hit. The combined explosion was catastrophic. It blew a 20-foot hole in the ship's side, completely destroying what was left of the rear deckhouse and sending a fresh wave of fire and shrapnel through the ship. The impact was so violent it jammed the Laffey's rudder hard to the left. Even if they could restore power, they would be stuck steaming in circles. And then came a fifth plane. A Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, sleek and fast, plunged down from the starboard side. With the ship's automated gun directors knocked out by the previous hits, the gunners had to aim by hand, local control. A young gunnery officer, Lieutenant Frank Manson, stood exposed on the deck, shouting ranges and bearings to his crews. The Judy dove through their desperate fire and dropped its bomb. The bomb was a direct hit on the 5-inch gun mount just forward of the bridge, Mount 52, the same one the Oscar's bomb had bounced off moments before. This time, the bomb penetrated the turret's armored roof and exploded inside, killing the entire gun crew instantly and starting yet another major fire, this one dangerously close to the ship's forward ammunition magazine. The Laffey was now burning from bow to stern, dead in the water, its rudder jammed, with a significant portion of its crew dead or wounded. The attack had been going on for less than 20 minutes. The crisis aboard the USS Laffey had reached a fever pitch. With the forward gun turret, Mount 52, transformed into an inferno and threatening to detonate the entire forward third of the ship, damage control became the most critical battle. Lieutenant Frank Manson, the gunnery officer who had been directing fire from the open deck, was now a firefighter. He scrambled toward the burning turret, knowing that the magazine below it held hundreds of 5-inch shells. If the heat reached them, the Laffey would simply cease to exist. He and a handful of sailors, armed with fire hoses, braved the flames and the risk of secondary explosions. The heat was so intense it warped the steel bulkheads and blistered the paint off the deck. Yet, just as Manson's team began to get a stream of water onto the blaze, the sky screamed again. A sixth aircraft, another Judy dive bomber, was plummeting towards them. This pilot, however, was not aiming for the ship itself. He was aiming for the men on the deck, specifically Manson and his firefighting party. The plane roared down, its machine guns spitting fire, forcing the sailors to abandon their hoses and dive for their lives. The Judy pulled up at the last second, the pilot having achieved his goal of disrupting the damage control efforts, and banked away. But his escape was short-lived. The ever-vigilant combat air patrol corsairs, which had been circling like guardian angels, pounced. In a brief, violent dogfight, the Judy was shot down, exploding harmlessly 1,000 yards from the ship. It was a small victory, but it bought Manson and his men precious seconds. They scrambled back to their hoses, their faces black with soot, and resumed their desperate fight against the fire that was trying to consume their ship from within. As if the universe were testing the absolute limits of human endurance, a seventh attacker materialized. This was not a bomber or a fighter, but another Aichi Val, and it approached from the port quarter, low and fast. The remaining gunners, exhausted and traumatized, swiveled to meet the new threat. Mount 41, one of the few remaining operational 40mm Bofors mounts, laid a perfect stream of tracers directly into the plane's path. The Val flew straight into the wall of explosive shells and simply disintegrated in a massive fireball before it could reach the ship. The explosion was so close that it rained flaming debris and oil across the port side, starting several small new fires, but the ship itself had been spared a direct impact. The crew barely had time to register their relief when the eighth plane screamed in. It was a Ki-43 Oscar, identical to the one that had strafed the bridge. This one came from the starboard quarter, jinking and weaving to throw off the gunner's aim. It was clear the pilot was experienced. He ignored the hail of 20mm and 40mm shells, his eyes fixed on the Laffey's wounded superstructure. He crashed directly into the base of the main radar mast, the very nerve center of the ship's detection capability. The impact and explosion sheared the massive SG surface search radar antenna from its mount, sending it crashing down onto the deck. The ship was now blind. What little electronic advantage she had possessed was gone. They were reduced to relying solely on the eyes and instincts of the lookouts, men whose senses were already overwhelmed by the smoke, fire, and unending noise of battle. The ninth attacker was a Val, and it chose a novel, terrifying angle of attack. It dove from almost directly overhead, out of the glare of the midday sun. The lookouts didn't spot it until it was already in its terminal dive. The remaining guns capable of elevating that high fired frantically, but it was too late. The plane, its engine screaming like a circular saw, slammed into the deck right beside the still-burning Mount 52 gun turret. It was the third direct hit in that same small area of the ship. The force of this new explosion was immense, buckling the deck plates and finally overwhelming Lieutenant Manson's firefighting party. Several men were killed instantly. Manson himself was blown clear across the deck, his body riddled with shrapnel. The fires, which had been on the verge of being controlled, now raged with renewed, unstoppable fury. It seemed to be the final, fatal blow. Captain Becton, watching the carnage from his smoke-filled bridge, had to confront the most dreaded decision a captain can make. He turned to his signalman. "Prepare to abandon ship," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. The signalman began to ready the flags, a final admission that the Laffey was lost. But as he reached for the halyards, a voice, filled with defiance, shouted up from the deck below. "We've still got guns that can shoot. We're not abandoning this ship." It was the voice of a gunner, a young man who refused to give up. Becton hesitated. He looked at the fires, the smoke, the dead in the water. He looked at the few guns still firing. And in that moment, he made a different choice. "Belay that order," he commanded the signalman. The USS Laffey would fight on, or it would go to the bottom. The climax of the 80-minute ordeal came from two directions at once. Two more Japanese planes, a Judy and another Val, the 10th and 11th attackers to reach the ship, began coordinated runs from the port and starboard bows. It was a classic pincer maneuver, designed to split the ship's defenses. But the Laffey had one last trick. Deep within the ship, in the forward plotting room, a young officer had managed to jury-rig a connection to the main gun director. He could feed targeting data to the last operational 5-inch turret, Mount 51, located just forward of the bridge. As the Judy screamed in from starboard, the guns of Mount 51, firing under this desperate, improvised control, roared one last time. The shell caught the Judy mid-dive, obliterating it in a flash of light. At the exact same moment, the Val coming in from the port side was met by a wall of fire from the corsairs of the Combat Air Patrol, who had been relentlessly circling the ship. The Val cartwheeled into the sea, sending up a huge plume of water. And then, silence. The roar of diving engines ceased. The sky, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was empty of attackers. The battle was over. The smoke-choked air was filled only with the crackle of flames, the hiss of water from the fire hoses, and the groans of the wounded. The USS Laffey was still afloat. It was a wreck, a floating charnel house, but it had not sunk. Out of an estimated 22 Japanese aircraft that had directly assaulted the ship, she had been struck by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. Yet she survived. In the aftermath, the full cost of survival became horrifyingly clear. The decks of the Laffey were a scene of indescribable devastation. Twisted metal, gaping holes, and the charred remnants of aircraft were everywhere. Fire still burned, and the ship listed heavily, its decks slick with a grim mixture of seawater, oil, and blood. Out of a crew of 344 men, 32 were dead or missing, and 71 were wounded. It was a staggering casualty rate, but miraculous given the sheer violence of the assault. As damage control parties, aided by crews from support ships that now cautiously approached, fought to quell the last of the fires and tend to the wounded, Captain Becton surveyed his vessel. The Laffey was a testament to both the resilience of her construction and the indomitable spirit of her crew. She had absorbed more kamikaze hits than any other ship in a single engagement and had not gone down. Her story would become legend in the U.S. Navy, earning her the nickname the ship that would not die. Slowly, under tow, the battered destroyer began its long, painful journey away from Radar Picket Station 1. On the other side of the battle, at airfields like Kanoya, the results of Kikusui No. 3 were assessed. Hundreds of pilots, young men like Saburo Sakai, had been expended. Some had found their targets, inflicting terrible damage. Many, like Kenji, had simply vanished into the sea, their sacrifice witnessed by no one. For Japan, the strategy was a grim arithmetic of desperation, trading their last generation of youth for a few more weeks of resistance. For the men on the receiving end, like the crew of the USS Laffey, it was a uniquely personal hell, an 80-minute glimpse into the abyss where fanaticism and warfare met in a final, fiery embrace.